2. Van Til and Amsterdam. It was with sadness that Paul observed, quote, "For they are not all Israel which are of Israel." Romans 9:6. With similar sadness, it must be observed that they are not all of Amsterdam who are of Amsterdam. What then does Amsterdam stand for? Calvinism had for some years been steadily on the decline. Its defeat was all the more telling in that the intellectual caliber of Presbyterian and Reformed scholars was so clearly outstanding. The Church, by and large, however, increasingly rejected Calvinism, and the apologetics of these scholars had a declining impact and audience. In America, for example, the intellectual preeminence of the Calvinist scholars at Princeton was obvious, and there is no denying the greatness of its history to 1929. But that tradition, so richly appreciated by Van Til, nevertheless had as its assumption the belief that the natural man was able to do two things. Quote, A. To work up a natural theology that would show theism to be more probably true than any other theory of reality, and B. To show that Christianity is more probably true than any other theory of sin and redemption. End quote. Behind this assumption lay two deadly presuppositions. First, the autonomy of the natural man, who could act as judge over reality, and second, the impartiality of the natural man, who was expected to assess honestly an interpretation he was at war against. Calvin had emphasized the perversity of the natural man's reasoning and its vicious partiality. Calvinism could not produce an adequate apologetics with the presuppositions of the natural man. To expect man, the covenant breaker, to be impartial with regard to factuality is like expecting a thief to sit impartially as judge and jury over himself. And against this approach, Abraham Kuyper rebelled because it assumed the validity of two ultimate and mutually exclusive principles, the autonomy of natural man and the sovereignty of the self-contained God. Kuyper set out, therefore, to rid apologetics and Christian philosophy of these two mutually exclusive ultimates and to establish Christian thought on the firm basis of the ontological Trinity. This he did to an amazing and revolutionary degree, recalling Calvinism to its biblical presuppositions and to Calvin's premises. That at various points inconsistency remained in Kuyper is not surprising, but the unquestionable direction in Kuyper is clearly to eliminate the contradiction. These inconsistencies, however, have been appealed to by champions of the older apologetics, such as Ritterboss and Masselink, in support of their position, while in Bavent we have a further emphasis and development of Kuyper's position. Despite bitter opposition, the Amsterdam view has flourished and has, as its leading European figures today, D.H.T. Volhoven and H. Duurwoord, both professors of the Free University of Amsterdam, and in America, Van Til. The impact of this school has been more extensive outside the church circles and schools than within, and Duurwoord can speak of, quote, the rise of a circle, though it be still modest, of scientific adherents, each of whom endeavours in his own department to make the newly developed philosophy fruitful. End quote. It is not our concern here to delineate the various facets of thought in these men, but to point to their common effort to bring human thinking to epistemological self-consciousness and to lay bare the religious presuppositions of all thought. They are Calvinists and regard Calvinism as Christianity come into its own, as fully self-consistent and true to its biblical faith. The Amsterdam position is being developed in the history of philosophy of history by K.J. Popma, in sociology by K. van Ryzen, and in other fields by other men. Van Til, in the philosophy of religion and in apologetics, has developed these same principles. His own syllabus on the metaphysics of apologetics was written prior to Volhoven's publication of The Necessity of a Christian Logic or Methodology, but on the whole, Van Til has been slower in publishing than the men of Amsterdam. His relative isolation in America and the heavy burden of teaching and extensive lecturing, as well as his insistence on a very extensive research of contemporary and past studies in each field, has limited his writing, which, it is to be hoped, will now be more frequent. There has been no attempt to challenge the basic premise of this school of thought, namely that two mutually exclusive ultimates cannot exist. The common attack on this school, as in Hackett's criticism of Van Til and all, quote, metaphysical presuppositionalism, end quote, is an insistence that common ground does exist between the two ultimates. Hackett remarks that unbelievers, like Christians, quote, apprehend their experience as rational. What they fail to do is carry through this apprehension to its highest explanation in the affirmation of God's reality, end quote. There is, quote, a basic epistemological structure common to all minds as rational and with a common world of facts, end quote. This, to Hackett, is a better starting point, in that it provides neutral ground than that of presuppositionalism. Quote, the first and most basic assertion of presuppositionalism is that one must start with the assumption that the God who is spoken in Scripture is the true God, end quote. Such an, quote, approach lands one ultimately in an extreme Calvinist atmosphere, end quote, hardly desirable surroundings, apparently, as compared to common ground with natural man. All men have reason in common and the same facts to deal with. Their problem is inconsistency rather than radical hostility. Unless the world is what the natural man says it is, there can be no reasoning possible, it is held. Hackett wants to hold to man's freedom and rationality in a void, as though they could exist in themselves and give independent witness to factuality and the nature of things. There is a tenacious refusal to face up to the fact that two mutually exclusive ultimates are presupposed. The barren and sterile reassertions of the traditional Arminian position are as commonplace as they are ineffectual. Its axioms of autonomy and common rationality are held to be universally binding and beyond criticism, but, as Duyvert has observed, quote, it is also not permissible to handle the so-called autonomy of philosophic thought as a theoretical axiom which could escape from a transcendental critique. This latter does not require indeed that anybody should abandon this quote-unquote autonomy as a quote-unquote postulate. Its sole requirement is that such a quote postulate end quote should be perused in its true nature, and that it should not pass for a criterion of scientific character, end quote. The axioms of natural man are prejudices based on and, quote, ruled by a basic prejudice that turns out to have no philosophical character at all, and that should be unmasked by a real transcendental criticism of philosophical thought, end quote. The resistance to this examination and the unwillingness to face up to the question of presuppositions is not surprising. Man resists the implications of his position and the consequences of epistemological self-consciousness, but he cannot evade them.